The coin with which we pay for our golden future is death, the death of our enemies slain in battle and of our own people, sacrificed on the altar of progress. Each death is a stone that lies upon my soul, a wound that my legion bears with pride, and our burden shall herald the golden age which the Emperor foresaw. Sanguinius, Primarch of the 9th Legion Blood Angels. Talassar, a storm-ravaged oceanic world in the southern portion of the Ultramar stellar realm, served as a recruitment base and gene seed repository for the Ultramarines Legion. All contact with it was lost following the events at Calth, when the southern regions of Ultramar were subjected to the horrors of the Shadow Crusade and then encountered the dead realms of the Night Lords emerging as if from nowhere. Talassar was one of several planets to which fleets were dispatched with the mission to obtain the genetic material of the 13th Legion, to ease the recruitment of new warriors after the losses suffered at Calth. At the end of the 10th year of the 31st millennium, the 9th Legion, the Blood Angels, led by Judge Aster arrived on Talassar. The sons of Sanguinius followed the decree of Gilliman and the orders of their Primarch, and were just one of many fleets seeking a remedy for the losses of the Ultramarines Legion. They descended upon Talassar in full combat readiness. 9 warships and a dozen Xiphons broke through the planet's rain-laden atmosphere, carrying with them 150 legionaries assembled from the orphaned remnants of the companies that survived the battle at Cygnus. The aircraft roared over the meadows of Talassar, then over the siege lines erected on the outskirts of Velx city. There, the self-propelled artillery units Basilisk of the 209th Solar Auxilia Cohort, the Gilded Guardians deployed ahead of the Legion's assault, began unleashing their fury on the distant citadel Castrum Velx, sending a relentless hail of shells into the bastion's shields. Several red-clad groups stood vigil over the grey and gold-clad artillerymen of the 209th. A reserve of 100 Blood Angels was deployed as a rapid response group in case the raging battle in the depths of Velx city moved closer to the mortal positions. A winged division of Blood Angels surged forward through the smoke-darkened skies above the city's streets, flying over the embattled 246th Solar Auxilia Cohort Radiant Host, bound to the 9th Legion by ties of loyalty and ancestral oaths, and over the ruins of buildings that had proudly stood mere hours ago. The Auxilia faced the inhabitants of Talassar, who had betrayed their oaths to the Emperor and the Imperium, for the local militia, once loyal to Ultramar, had declared the Night Lords as their masters. Their new patrons harried the battle's periphery. Packs of midnight-clad legionaries descended from the heavens to seize the unfortunate and drag them into the shadows, their cries amplified by vox networks, drowning out the very roar of battle. Resolute in his intention to assault Castrum Velx, Crone ignored the plea for aid from the 246th Cohort and the warning from Kafsiel, the Seraph of the Sanguinary Guard, and the first among the depleted Elite 7 tasked with accompanying the Judge. According to the campaign chronicles, during the invasion planning, Kafsiel advocated for a methodical advance into Velx city, followed by a siege of its Castrum fortress, which had become the vile den of the Night Lords, who had seized Talassar. Aster Crone disregarded his counsel and once again acted according to his own will. The Judge was renowned as a bloodthirsty and exceptionally stubborn commander, and within the fortress lay the coveted prize for which he was dispatched. Thus for him it was a rightful target. Before boarding his gunship, Crone declared as follows: "If the Seraphim wish to wallow in the dirt, let them guard the rear of the Solar Auxilia against enemy assaults until they are needed in the war." Castrum Velx rose on a cape overlooking the Velx city coast, its armoured walls casting a menacing shadow over the city. The centuries-old walls were pocked with craters from exploding artillery shells, and the burning gun batteries on the parapets marked the spots where cracks had appeared in the enemy defences. However, its final destruction was still far off, and to the artillery barrage was added the deafening clamour of anti-aircraft guns, unleashing a storm of fire upon the approaching Blood Angels' air forces. Tracers and anti-aircraft salvos filled the sky, a deadly hurricane of munitions sweeping planes from the heavens, sending flaming debris crashing down onto the traitorous positions in the city streets. Crone didn't know if anyone had survived the crash, Since as the Ninth Legion's warriors neared Castrum Velx, the interference in the Vox network grew stronger. A crackling noise mingled with echoes of Crone's own words, and the whisper of chants alternating between Low Gothic and Nostraman. "Lancer high," they said, "the one who trapped them, the one who awaited them, the one who will flay them again and again." Crone's personal Thunderhawk could not withstand the fury unleashed upon it. One of its wings was severed by a blinding beam of light, and the pilot struggled to steer the crashing ship towards the fortress in a last bid to land beyond the walls. The assault craft went down, smashing into the dam leading up the cliff face, and came to rest 50 meters below the fortress gates. Crone emerged from the wreckage of his Thunderhawk to find the remnants of his strike force scattered across the fortress approaches, all his aircraft downed, having crashed either upon the rocky escarpments or the neighbouring city streets. The legionaries seeking shelter were knocked down. Those who were too slow were torn apart by a volley of bolter fire unleashed by the Night Lords from distant parapets. Others fell, struck by shrapnel, in the form of stone fragments when heavy defensive guns unleashed their wrath upon the sons of Sanguinius attempting to take cover among the rocks. No calls for help could be sent, as the Vox networks were jammed by interference emitted by the traitorous forces. The only barely adequate shelter for Crone and his warriors were the smouldering wrecks of their aircraft. However, these provided scant protection from the traitors' weapons. In the heart of the storm, further advancement meant almost certain death for Crone and his warriors, whose number had dwindled to barely 24 men. Staying in position meant being torn to pieces, and retreating across the causeway meant acknowledging defeat, and likewise finding themselves within enemy firing range. Seeing no alternatives, save the faintest hope for victory, Crone rose from his position behind the crumpled cockpit of a Thunderhawk. Enemy fire ricocheted off his power field and armour. The Judicator raised his power axe and shouted the order. The roar of the surrounding guns drowned out his words. Crone rushed across the stone causeway, his eyes fixed on the gatehouse at its end. The warriors left behind noticed their commander charging and followed his lead. As Crone and his warriors moved forward, the air above them was torn apart by the fortress guns of Castrum Velx, but this time the anti-aircraft guns were targeting not the ground troops, but a fresh flock of approaching Thunderhawks and Storm Eagles. Leading them was an armoured giant, a Sokar-patterned stormbird, whose wings were adorned with golden trimming, and a winged mask of the Sanguinary Guard emblazoned on its fuselage. The stormbird was surrounded by a halo of light. Its void shields flared, absorbing and reflecting the fire directed at it, and its mighty armour compelled the enemy to ignore the ships following behind, for they aimed to down the largest of the Blood Angel's winged machines. In response, the Sokar launched missiles and unleashed a volley from its lascannons, turning a dozen of the gun batteries below into burning twisted metal. The assault vessels dove and landed at the base of the promontory, but the Stormbird continued its course, soaring over the advancing Blood Angels. About a dozen fresh legionary corpses in red armour were left sprawled on the causeway. The rear door of the Stormbird opened, and a colossal figure emerged. The stone from which the causeway was made cracked as Dreadnought Hamona landed and straightened up before Crone and the handful of his surviving warriors. The Contemptor's assault cannon opened fire on the wall, suppressing the entrenched Night Lords and destroying those who failed to dive into cover quickly enough. With a thundering stride, Hamona led the attack towards the gates, and his armoured figure became a reliable bulwark for his brothers against the wrathful barrage of the Castrum's defenders. The Stormbird flew further, passing over the gatehouse, its void shields flaring brightly under the aim of the bastion's anti-aircraft guns, and from this radiance emerged golden figures. They immediately descended upon the wall and its defenders. The spear of Kafsil, the first to land, pierced the eye lens of one of the traitors before the Blood Angel touched the ground. As soon as the Night Lord Legionnaire fell dead, Kafsiel pulled out his spear and knocked a second enemy off the wall with a blow of the shaft, after which the weapon's tip pierced a third, who burst into bright flames the moment the warrior of the 9th fired from the Seraphim pattern Inferno pistol combined with the spear. The rest of the Sanguinary Guard landed around their commander, while the Night Lords on the walls were already revving chainswords and drawing blades. Like a golden fist amidst the dark blue enemy ranks, the sanguinary guard carved a bloody path through the gates, exterminating one traitor after another and throwing them off the walls with precise strikes of swords and axes. With them landed the angels' tears, unleashing volleys of Volkite fire on the Night Lords in the courtyard below and driving them from defensive positions around the gates. The Stormbird continued its flyby over the Castrum, the excess pressure from its disabled shield smashing the windows of buildings in the inner courtyards. The noble ship's final act of participation in the battle was a sacrifice. A salvo of missiles and volleys from Las cannons pierced a row of communication towers hidden in the fortress's shadows, silencing the Vox interference. The Nostraman chants fell silent, drowned by voices and commands in baylight. Having delivered its cargo and fulfilled its duties, the Stormbird attempted to withdraw, but its shields were down, the hull was torn, and the engines were ablaze. Methodical anti-aircraft fire finally breached the multi-layered armour, and the Stormbird crashed down, ploughing a furrow among the stone masonry of the palace. The actions of the sanguinary guard distracted attention from Kron's men, and the revered Hamona, having reached the gates, crashed into the thick metal, tearing them from their fittings. The dreadnought's momentum carried it forward, its armoured chassis scattering the Night Lords who were exchanging fire with the angels' tears atop the wall. The sweeping blows of Hamona's power fist crushed the traitors. Those who escaped his lethal wrath were gunned down by the bolters of Kron's advancing fighters. The few surviving Night Lords fled, some retreating while firing their bolters at the Blood Angels, while others tried to take cover in the buildings of the inner courtyard. Kron forbade the pursuit of survivors, gathering the remaining warriors around him to defend the gate ambush from an enemy counterattack until the reserves deployed at the dam's base could arrive. The assault continues. The Blood Angels gathered in the shadow of the gates as Kron's surviving forces made their way into the court of Castrum Velx. Nearly half of the Judicia's strike contingent had already been wounded or killed during the assault, so he disbanded the most battered units, replenishing them with disparate elements. Standing in complete silence on the gate wall, Kaftsiel grimly observed as repeatedly wounded legionaries in damaged armour gathered next to their unharmed red-golden brothers, while the Seraphim scanned the courtyard for signs of a counterattack that never came. Since the enemy no longer occupied the courtyard, Kron ordered his warriors to surround the central keep, a grand bastion where once ultramarine aspirants were trained. Only after the Justiciar mobilized his forces before the central entrance to the fortress did the Sanguinary Guard join his assault forces, leaving the walls and taking their place in the ranks assembled before the Blood Angels' doors. The metal doors loomed ominously over the legionaries. The doors were twice the height of an Astartes, each engraved with scenes of the Emperor's arrival on Macragge. The magnificent bas-relief was desecrated by flayed corpses hung on chains over the glorious images. The vanguard pioneers locked their shields before the entrance, with Kron standing next to them, while Hamona stepped forward, striking the plasteel door with his fist. The metal bent. Contemptor pulled back his hand for a second strike, but before his fist could reach its target, the door's structure was ripped apart by a series of explosions, and an avalanche of stone and fire crashed onto the dreadnought. The dreadnought's arm was torn from its shoulder socket, its armoured body buried to the waist in debris, and the assault cannon barrels bent and broke. The Blood Angels, closest to the door, were annihilated by the shockwave. Kron himself was knocked off his feet, but the protective field of the iron halo preserved his life. Shrapnel and debris swept through the rows of more distant Blood Angels, breaking bones and tossing Astartes aside. The air filled with clouds of stone dust, amidst which Blood Angels officers shouted orders to regroup. Meanwhile, from behind the dust-shrouded threshold, traitors unleashed a bolter and plasma barrage on the enemy, decimating the legionaries as they moved towards the now broken doors and forcing the survivors to scatter in search of cover. The Sons of Sanguinius unleashed volleys into the haze, firing at the blurred outlines of enemies displayed in the targeting reticles of their helmets. But hits were few, and not a single figure fell. Small groups of legionaries surged forward, but were pinned down by enemy volleys in the debris-littered courtyard. The blood-covered stonework and bodies of their brothers were the only available cover in this situation. Near the threshold littered with debris, a few meters from his warriors, Crone fell to his knees. His helmet had been shattered, and his axe lost beneath the door's ruins. Stray shots pierced his armor, but none intended to kill him. Instead, enemy hands reached for the judge, grabbing him by the legs and dragging him into the fortress. Each captor of Aster Crone was clad in mismatched sets of cobalt blue ultramarine armor. Yet, despite wearing power armor and matching the Astartes in size and strength, only pitiful remnants of their deserved majesty remained. None wore helmets, their bodies were covered in scars, and gilded metal wires, shaped like the Nostroman glyph for slave, were embedded in their skulls. Such were the inductii of the Night Lords, broken souls turned into mindless tools. The inductii dragged the judge through the barrage. One was hit, but showed no sign of pain. His eyes were dead, reflecting great sorrow and a shattered mind. Crone kicked, trying to free himself, but more hunched legionaries attacked, and a pack of thoughtless creatures dragged the judge further towards the traitors' positions. When the judge disappeared from view, Castrum rushed forward, blindly diving into the fading mist, and all of his seraphim, without waiting for orders, followed their commander. The Golden Warriors stormed into the wide hall, once a hospitable place with marble columns and intricately tiled floors, now occupied by barricades of stone and ceramite. Their jump packs allowed them to fly over the first line of defence and crash into the thick of the Night Lord's ranks. Unfortunately, their reinforced armour, which deflected enemy fire well, worked against them by reducing the power of their jump packs, and they did not land among the inductii who had dragged Crone deeper into the building. Inferno gunbursts repelled the surrounding legionaries of the Night Lords, disintegrating both flesh and armour upon impact, while the blade of the seraphim named Tervelt, who managed to break through to the captured judge, cleaved the inductii holding Crone in half. The gold-clad warriors formed a ring around the fallen judge as he got to his feet. 8 warriors of the 9th Legion stood in the middle of the hall, while traitors roamed around them in significantly greater numbers. Justice. Surrounded by foes on all sides, Crone and the Sanguinary Guard had only a moment to assess the threat and decide their next actions. The other Blood Angels surged forward to secure a foothold for their continued advance. Legionary flamethrower units unleashed torrents of fire to push the traitors back behind the barricades, clearing the way for the Sons of Sanguinius to advance. Groups of Night Lords near the Seraphim began to retreat toward the walls, directing their weapons away from the doorway into the hall's interior. Deep within the chamber, around 20 inductii of the Night Lords gathered at the foot of a dais. Their armour a chaotic jumble of colours and insignia, all marked with scars from battles they had undoubtedly fought. Upon the dais stood a throne, flanked by a pair of Terminators on either side, their bulky armour in midnight hues contrasting starkly with the white-faced legionaries seated upon the throne. His shoulder displayed the mark of an apothecary, and identification tags recognised him as Lancer High of the 8th Legion. A mocking smile played across his face. Castrum looked to Cronus, awaiting orders, and the Judicator barked a command for the advance in the Baal battle tongue, after which the red and gold warriors rushed towards the throne. A pair of seraphim moved from the right side, another pair from the left, each unit engaging one of the Night Lords' groups to buy time for their brothers advancing on the throne. Brief activations of their jump packs granted them speed, allowing the Seraphim to close with the Night Lords before the traitors could open fire. The blood-soaked blades of the Blood Angels blazed. Each pair of Seraphim fought shoulder to shoulder, their masterful blades slicing through the traitors' armour and severing limbs, while their own golden armour provided the Astartes effective protection against chainswords and serrated knives. However, they were only 4 against 20. And soon the Seraphim found themselves surrounded by enemies striking from all sides, forcing the elite Blood Angels to switch to defensive combat stances just to survive and hold their ground. The first Seraphim fell to a chain glaive that pierced his flank, while the second was struck by a burst from a bolter at point-blank range, shattering his damaged helmet. Suddenly, the Night Lord's centre line, just a few steps away from the embattled Seraphim, crumpled, and then was breached. The Volkite fire scorched the Night Lords to the bone as the tears of the angel broke through the gap in their ranks, and the Seraphim were saved. The two survivors immediately surged forward into the mass of enemies to hold the breach torn in the traitorous line. The rearguard Blood Angels followed the path cleared by the angels' tears, holstering their bolters and drawing chainswords with a single practiced motion, after which a fresh roar of engines joined the cacophony of battle echoing through the hall. While the Blood Angels stormed the barricades of the Night Lords, Cafsiel and the remaining Seraphim attacked the throne. Their jump packs gave them sufficient momentum to smash into the throng of fresh Inductii with crushing force. Wounded but driven by a thirst for vengeance, Crone paused only to pick up a weapon before also charging into the fray. The four Blood Angels became a relentless hurricane of blades, axes and spears, cutting through the poorly protected Inductii. Each Legionnaire's strike found a weak spot in their fragile armour, and although the Inductii fought with the ferocity of savage beasts, they were unable to deliver a fatal blow to their enemy. Numbers were their only advantage. The Inductii encircled the Blood Angels, carving a path to the throne where the apothecary sat and his Terminator guard stood. The advance slowed. The Inductii chainswords rained down on the Seraphim, too numerous for even the most skilled fencers to evade. The armour of the Sanguinary Guard became dented and scored, the gold almost hidden under the enemy's blood. Yet even their numerical advantage did not allow them to match the much more skilled Seraphim. 10 paces from the throne, the crowd of Inductii was shattered. Only a dozen remained standing, and the gutted remnants of the rest carpeted the floor behind the vengeful Blood Angels. Those few who survived faltered and then broke, rushing to hide at the back of the hall to escape the ire of the Seraphim. Seated on the throne and frowning, Lansahai observed the battle with the piercing gaze of a vivisector dissecting a medical specimen. When the majority of his Inductii fell, he gestured for the Night Lords to follow him, then rose and turned away from the fighting Seraphim, mockingly strolling towards the far end of the hall. As the Inductii rushed past him, he gestured again, and his Terminators turned to face the Seraphim, while Lansahai himself withdrew to his lair. Sanfon was the first to reach the Night Lords, driving his blazing inferno axe deep into the layered armour of a Terminator's pauldron. In response, the clawed hand of the 8th Legionnaire shot up and pierced the Seraphim's torso. While the second Night Lord faced off against Crone and Tervelt simultaneously, Cafsiel confronted his brother's killer, spear in hand. Closing in on his opponent, he unleashed a flurry of strikes. The target's massive armour deflected 3 of them, but the 4th plunged deep into the broken pauldron, and the heavy smell of burning flesh spread as the fire of the spear poured into the traitor's wound. The traitor attempted to reach the Seraphim with his claws, but Cafsiel managed to recoil backward. Cafsiel's attention was drawn by movement. At the back of the hall, Lansahai was within arm's reach of the door. In one smooth motion, the commander of the Sanguinary Guard raised his spear and hurled it at the vile apothecary. The flaming weapon pierced the air, flew over the shoulder of another Terminator, and struck Lansahai in the chest, breaching armour, bones and flesh, pinning the heretic to the stone wall behind. Flames charred Lansahai's armour black as he fruitlessly tried to wrench the spear free, but Cafsiel did not see what happened next, as lightning claws slammed into his side, causing the Seraphim to collapse onto the floor. The Night Lord's Terminator was already poised to deliver a fatal blow, but at that moment a blazing axe smashed through his helmet along with its contents. Having dispatched the enemy he was battling himself, Aster Crone picked up the fallen Sanfon's weapon and, with a precise strike, saved his fellow legionnaire. Cafsiel attempted to rise, but was knocked down again as explosions echoed throughout the hall. The ceiling began to collapse, sending a stony deluge of debris. The throne dais and the surrounding area were quickly buried under a layer of stone, and Crone and the surviving Seraphim barely managed to escape the rocky avalanche. Both the Blood Angels and the Night Lords rushed towards the exit to avoid the dreadful fate of being crushed. Although the Blood Angels attempted to resume the fight, the majority of the Night Lords had already begun to retreat. abandoning those who were too severely wounded to move swiftly. Some of the traitors withdrew into the corridors, branching off from the main hall. Where the Blood Angels tried to pursue them, explosions tore through the corridors, killing both traitors and loyalists, as the Night Lords attempted to seal the passages behind them at any cost. Stragglers were hacked apart by the chainswords of the Blood Angels, who showed no mercy to the treacherous heretics. Duty fulfilled. After the battle, Crone regrouped his warriors, dispatching strike teams into the catacombs below to search for the biovaults that the Blood Angels' contingent had been sent to protect. Some were found open, their genetic locks breached and contents plundered, but the majority remained untouched. Previously acquired cipher engrams allowed the seals to be removed, and the Blood Angels' apothecaries began loading gene seed for transport to orbit. Having accomplished their mission, albeit at the cost of a dreadful slaughter, Crone ordered his forces to leave Talassar, issuing the corresponding command to the still-engaged auxiliary cohort in Velx city. The only delay in the evacuation was Kafziel's desire to excavate the throne room ruins. Despite this, the Blood Angels never found any trace of Lancehigh or the spear that had impaled him. Aster Crone rejected any options for further investigation, pursuit, and the inevitable delay that would ensue. Other forces will arrive to liberate Talassar, and it will be their responsibility to hunt down the surviving traitors. Sanguinius ordered them to preserve the genetic treasure and return it to Macragge, rather than conduct a campaign of conquest and occupation, so Crone complied. The 9th Legionnaires left behind a Talassar mired in lawlessness. The Night Lord's dominion over the world was broken, yet there were no loyalists to replace them. Many months will pass before new loyalist fleets arrive to restore order and legality, but the blight of the Night Lord's presence will be largely expunged, with only a few worlds in the region remaining under the 8th Legion's control. Gradually, the balance of power in the realm of Ultramar will shift in favor of the Loyalists. As the Age of Darkness approached, a war-consuming flame spread throughout the galaxy. The worlds of its armies were reduced to ashes, often leaving no survivors to tell of the sacrifices and wicked deeds committed. At this time, each of the legions employed unique units that engaged in unconventional warfare, resorting either willingly or out of necessity to abhorrent tactics and weaponry. Many such formations were lost in the grim years following the heresy and its aftermath, with their traditions destroyed and arsenals depleted. Nevertheless, information on some of them is preserved in these records, so that future generations may learn of the horrors unleashed upon the galaxy by the Emperor's traitor sons, as well as the valiant heroes who opposed them. Being one of the smaller Forge worlds in the northern part of Segmentum Ultima, Ohmn served as a waypoint for expeditionary fleets advancing towards the eastern fringe during the middle and later years of the Great Crusade. As the Imperium's borders expanded and the galactic frontier pushed further east, the Forge world's production capabilities were redirected, with most of the planet's industrial output now serving the needs of the nearby fortress world Stromhelm and the stellar infrastructure of surrounding subsectors. By the time the vanguard of Horus's Dark Empire began its invasion of the space near Ohmn, in the middle of the 8th year of the 31st millennium, this world was already engulfed in war. Rumors brought by panicked Chartist captains and a handful of survivors from the landing zone massacre about the atrocities of those who turned away from the Emperor reignited ancient disputes among the ruling circles of the Forge World Synod, plunging the planet into open conflict even before the War Master himself left the Istvan system. As a victim of the capricious policies of the Martian Mechanicum, Ohmn was stripped of the lion's share of its value after the expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade began bypassing it, with resources and personnel from entire Forge temples being completely relocated to other production sectors so distant from Ohmn that the very corner of space around it gradually became utterly barren. Nearly 2 years of internecine conflicts further undermined the welfare of the Forge world, turning it into little more than a wasteland in the eyes of traitors which was to be stripped bare, while plans were being devised for the conquest of the northern reaches of Segmentum Ultima. This responsibility fell upon Captain Jaron Dagon of the 16th Legion, an accolade-bearing veteran of fierce boarding wars during the recent conquest of Port Moore. Commanding an armada of several thousand sons of Horus and word-bearers, followed by millions of solar auxiliar troops and traitor militia, the fleet led by his own 84th Company, the Harbingers of Discord, was tasked with bringing the worlds at the intersection of warp routes between Cyclothratha and Honorum to what was called the Dark Accord of the War Master. One by one, planets succumbed to Horus's will, following mass executions initiated by his legionaries, with specialized overseer units within the ranks of the 16th, selected to facilitate the tithe of resources and flesh for the Mechanicum of Cyclothratha. Ohmn itself was destined by Captain Dagon for a much darker fate than merely becoming a feast for the scavengers of the Cyclothratha forges. The sheer scale of deaths that struck this world made it ideal as an offering for the dark crafts of the esotericists appointed by him, of course, after the appropriate preparations were made. Over 2 years, Jaron Dagon allowed the suffering and despair caused by the ongoing civil war on Ohmn to reach even greater heights, while his fleet orchestrated a campaign of surgically precise slaughter in the surrounding systems according to a scheme devised by the diabolists of the word-bearers and his own lodge masters. The already ruthless, mercenary doctrines of the 84th Company evolved into something far more sinister, reminiscent of mass ritualistic killings as defiant worlds were turned into mausoleum offerings for the greater glory of the 16th Legion. At the end of the 10th year of the 31st millennium, the spearhead of Jaron Dagon's fleet broke into real space at the outskirts of the Ohmn system. In over 2 years of ritual culling, his warriors caused such turmoil in the ether that only a handful of heretical navigators could ensure local warp transit with any degree of precision. Since the local shipyards and fleet had been destroyed at the very beginning of the Civil War, Dagon's fleet, carrying only his 84th Company, reached the orbit of the Forge world unimpeded. From there the traitors gazed upon a world ravaged by 4 years of fratricidal war, a scorched sphere pocked, as if with poxmarks, by the metal skeletons of forges lost in atomic fire and the all-devouring flames of phosphex. Nevertheless, amid the graves of billions, a handful of surviving forges and strongholds still rose. The surviving enclaves bombarded the Harbingers of Discord with desperate Vox messages, only to be met with silence. Captain Dagon quickly dismissed the scant aid that the forces of the traitors might offer his cause, valuing only the pain they would experience in the coming hours. Encountering no void resistance, the fleet of the Sons of Horus began assembling for a full combat drop over the loyalist Forge Temple Thyatira, marked by the bloodiest battles during the war for Ohmn, thus proving an ideal altar for the unfolding ritual of the traitors. As the skies of Ohmn were filled with a barrage of assault claws, the defensive lasers of Thyatira hastily opened suppressive fire. Their unsuitability for intercepting such small and maneuverable ships was briefly mitigated by the density of targets. Furthermore, the fiery screen during atmospheric entry blinded the sensors of the assault claws. Warning signals from the orbital fleet proved meaningless to the scattering dropships, resulting in about a dozen of the heaviest Harbinger assault claws unable to react due to their clumsiness. And in an instant, they were destroyed by searing beams of energy. Several more claws of terror fell under the apocalyptic light of defensive lasers, but the Sons of Horus's assault managed to withstand the most perilous phase of orbital deployment. Every kilometre crossed brought them closer to the minimum effective laser targeting range. Out of nearly 200 assault claws launched towards Thyatira, 9/10 thunderously landed intact. Melter cutters tore into layers of ablative ceramite and reinforced ferrocrete, breaching the upper levels of the Forge Temple's superstructure. Despite their success in penetrating almost half a kilometre deep into Thyatira, bypassing most of its external defences, The legionaries aboard each assault claw encountered fierce enemy resistance alone, and were forced to fight their way through a labyrinth of air ducts and corridors. Security sirens wailed as servitor work algorithms were abruptly cancelled, and trembling semi-living drones blocked the invading legionaries' path, who struck them down one by one with chain swords and bolt pistols. The lives of the servitors were expended with a simple objective: to buy time for the advancing forces of the Thyatira Tagmata. The maniples of the Silax Guardian Automata were the first fully-fledged military force that the Harbingers of Discord encountered. They swarmed the transit shafts and service channels, and sometimes awoke in niches when detachments of the Sons of Horus stumbled upon dormant garrison cells scattered throughout the perimeter of the forge's facade. The rotating mechadendrites and point-blank shots bit into the ceramite. But all these sporadic attacks could do little against the legionaries of the 16th, whose upbringing in the suffocating underground labyrinths of Chthoniya turned them into some of the fiercest tunnel fighters in the entire galaxy. Having reached the lower levels of Thyatira's outer section, the Harbingers of Discord first regrouped into units of 1 or 2 detachments, and soon into formations of several dozen legionaries, crushing the sparse defences and gathering in front of one of the wide portals leading into the inner part of the Forge Temple. While the core of the 84th Company's line unit survived and reached the rendezvous point relatively unscathed, the situation with the heavy support units of the Harbingers of Discord was far worse. Most of them perished along with the burning Charybdis in the skies of Ohmn. Gathering the remaining forces of his company, Captain Dagon gestured for the lone surviving Leviathan dreadnought of the raiders to advance and break the seals to the inner sanctuaries of Thyatira. The cyclone melter spear of the venerable Colossus blew apart the mechanisms of the entrance portal, and the massive blast doors crashed to the ground. As the assembled legionaries crossed the threshold into the inner depths of Thyatira, the lodge masters among them chanted blasphemous litanies promising their brothers gifts of secret power and resilience, which in turn would earn them the favour of the War Master, while the forces of Thyatira below stirred to action, like a hive of swarming insects. Controlled by the cybertheurgy of their Lacerimata masters, waves of tech thralls of the Ad Secularis surged to meet the traitors. However, salvos of laser fire from their side managed only to knock down a handful of already wounded legionaries, while the volleys of return bolter fire unleashed a bloody massacre and brought death to many roughly augmented slaves. Returning to the doctrines learned over years of the Great Crusade, the Sons of Horus employed flame, volkites and chain blades to clear a path forward, halting only when maniples of ferocious Vorax battle automata erupted from the unexpectedly created gaps in the ranks of the Ad Seculares, cutting vast swathes through the ranks of the traitors until they could be brought down with crack grenades and demolition melter charges. Captain Dagon understood that his men had thus far only encountered the vanguard of the Thyatira Tagmata, comprising its swiftest and most numerous servants, dispatched with the intent to harry and drain the Sons of Horus. Regardless of the scale of the massive counterattack he anticipated they would yet face, the depleted heavy reserves of the raiders would need to be employed with a known degree of caution before they reached their destination, where Dagon intended to play his final trump card. The hidden plan driving the 84th Company forward, utterly unfathomable to their adversaries, now served as one of the few advantages for the traitors, hopelessly trapped within the loyalist Forge world and stripped of all support. The logic of the Thyatira Synod suggested that the Sons of Horus would break into the heart of their bastion, aiming to disable the massive atomic reactors of the Forge Temple or seize control of the command center of the defensive laser arrays. Instead, the esotericists of the Heralds of Discord dictated to their brethren a path guided by their own occult predictions, with the warriors of the 16th making their way toward the convergence of seething warp matter concentrated in the depths of Thyatira. As the 84th Company advanced, scattered reports from hunting and reconnaissance detachments covering their flanks began to indicate a slow but inexorable mass of battle automata surging from the very heart of the Forge Temple. While the main body of the traitorous host, owing to their specific route, was fortunate enough to avoid encounters with the Mechanicum hordes, the elements forming the reconnaissance vanguard of the 16th Legion suffered severe losses in clashes with the Arlatax battle automata, which would surely have entrapped the Sons of Horus in a cauldron had they followed the Magos' predicted routes. 3 dreadnoughts from the dwindling Contemptor reserves of the traitors reluctantly remained to hold off the Arlatax, thereby allowing the remaining forces to proceed. New skirmishes between the Sons of Horus and the Mechanicum forces became increasingly protracted. Utilizing their brutal martial discipline, the Heralds of Discord flanked the main force of the Tagmata, surrounding and tearing apart the attacking Thyatira automata, though each downed Castellax or Domitar cost the lives of several legionnaires, crushed by the energy of crackling shock emitters or cleaved apart by screeching power blades. Ultimately, the Heralds of Discord resorted to demolishing tunnels and intersections with demolition charges to sever approaches, thus sacrificing entire detachments of their comrades to occupy the relentless Cybernetica automata and avoid being drawn into a protracted engagement capable of delaying their advance. By doing so, Captain Dagon's main assault forces managed to reach their target, the vast reaping factories of Lasiremata on Thyatira, nearly 3 hours after the start of the descent. Every fallen warrior of the 16th paved the way to the planned ascension of their brothers with his death. It was here that the core of the warp disturbance, noted by Dagon's esoterists, was located, the area of tormenting flesh metamorphoses conducted by Lasiremata, overseeing the procedures of conversion into thralls, assembly of servitors and biomass disposal. All of this poured the pain and torment of entire generations of Mechanicum helots into the warp. These miasmas of suffering reached new heights after the start of the civil war on Ohmn, when whole hordes of captured enemies were thrown into the reaping factories, where they underwent forcible cyber surgery and mind-binding to join the ranks of the ad secularis, or were dismantled and processed into nutrient slurry. Enhanced by the warp disturbances unleashed by the Traitors' campaign over the last 2 years, as well as the shroud of death looming over Thyatira and Ohmn as a whole, this aura of suffering stretched the veil separating the warp from the real space to its limits. Therefore, a more suitable place for the execution of the unholy spell, which was the focus of all traitorous efforts, could not be found. However, the dark ritual of the Heralds of Discord could not commence without opposition from the Loyalists. Hardly had the Sons of Horus finished slaying the last ad secularis scum, spewing out in droves from the slave barracks of Lasiremata, when a phalanx the colour of blackened gunmetal appeared at the far end of the reaping factories. The advanced augmetics of the newcomers distinguished them favourably from the crude cybernetic implants hammered into the bodies of the dying slaves. About 400 legionaries of the Iron Hands moved to face the traitors. The flat shields revealed them as the doomed from the so-called Medusan immortals. Their half-erased iconography visible on the armour of only a handful of dreadnoughts and assigned battle automata, which also stepped within the ranks of the Iron Tenth. At the head of this ominous host marched the leader Durante Osh, a scion of Clan Locopt in former times, and a thaumaturge of the disbanded Legion Librarium. His long-suppressed psychic talents warned him of the traitor's intentions. Not a single word was exchanged between Captain Dagon and the Iron Hands leader. The only greeting between the two sides of the conflict was the roar of the death vows of the Medusan immortals and the howling battle cries of Chthonian warriors, after which the ranks of hateful enemies erupted in bursts of bolter fire. While the vanguard of the 84th Company engaged in blade-to-blade combat with this new enemy, the Thyatira Tagmata pursuing them pressed inexorably forward. Reconnaissance detachments deployed as pickets along the path travelled by the Harbingers of Discord continued to suffer from Mechanicum attacks. The bolter fire of the Nemesids in the hands of the sons of Horus struck down a handful of tech priests and lesser magi, depriving the surrounding automata of a sense of direction. However, soon the Myrmidon Destructors' covenants joined the fray. They were not easily driven back, confidently advancing and flushing legionaries from their cover with torrents of flame. Literally caught between two fires, the Harbingers of Discord reformed into a defensive formation. Captain Dagon committed the last of his heavy units against the Thyatira Tagmata, while the breacher squads of the 84th Company formed their own shield wall, a mirror of the Iron Hands formation. Between these rapidly established front lines, the lodge masters of the Sons of Horus and the Esoterists began preparing their final ritual, hastily erecting half a dozen altars from industrial debris scattered amidst the maglev loading bays where the elite of the War Master sought to hold their ground. Raider detachments initiated sudden assaults using jump packs wherever the Medusan's shield wall buckled or broke. Chain axes struck sparks from hardened armor, and power fists crunched through flesh and bone. Each time they were pushed back, the raiders dragged with them mortally wounded or dying loyalist legionaries, a necessary sacrifice to fuel the unfolding sorcery. Several attempts at this heinous act were thwarted when potential captives managed to clutch armed grenades to their chests, while leader Osh, recognizing the grim intentions of the traitors, prowled the front line, repelling raider attacks with powerful swings of his thunderhammer and directing his Medusans to grant the Emperor's mercy to their fallen brothers rather than condemn them to the horror of captivity. Nonetheless, some Iron Hands suffered too severe wounds or lost consciousness altogether, thus unable to offer proper resistance, as they were delivered to the traitors' defensive cordon and makeshift ritual altars, which, even in such a situation, were lavishly anointed with blood. On the opposite side of the traitors' defensive front, the full might of the Thyatira Tagmata was finally unleashed against the Sons of Horus. Volleys of superheated plasma discharged by Myrmidon covenants and the siege automata Thanatar, each shot creating fresh craters in the maglev dams, provided a worthy counter to the Harbingers of Discord. Hundreds of legionaries unleashed a barrage of bolter fire on the approaching automata, and though perhaps every 10th Cybernetica warrior fell under their assault, the majority continued their imperturbable march, while mass reactive shells from the Sons of Horus merely glanced off reinforced ceramite or prematurely detonated against crackling energy fields. Against this seemingly unstoppable tide of iron, the last remaining dreadnoughts of the Harbingers of Discord launched themselves into battle, a pair of contemptors crashing into the ranks of the war automata moments before the following trio of Castraferums and one Leviathan providing heavy support. Savage weaponry tore through servos and shattered limbs, felling Domitars and reducing Castellax to smouldering heaps of ruin, their automaton bodies buckling under the crushing blows of fists or being torn apart by buzzing power claws. For 2 minutes, the Thyatira Tagmata was forced to halt. 6 dreadnoughts of the Sons of Horus, outnumbered perhaps 100 to 1, were slowly encircled by loyalist automata, inevitably falling one by one, as point-blank melter weaponry turned their limbs into molten slag, and graviton hammers reduced the bodies of the ancients to pulp within their sarcophagi. The lone Leviathan, survivor of the Harbingers of Discord's orbital strike, withstood the assault the longest, annihilating 3 Arl-attacks in its death throes, simultaneously by pushing its cyclonic melter-lance beyond operational limits, only to be pierced by half a dozen screaming power blades. As the battle raged, the first signs of success from Captain Dagon's spellcraft began to manifest. Augur systems recorded the appearance of phantom readings of bizarre figures, while Vox channels filled with faint chanting. Concealed between 2 parallel defensive lines of the Harbingers of Discord, groups of lodge adherents formed circles amidst ongoing ritual vivisections, with lodge masters and esoterists prolonging the death throes of their victims from among the Iron Hands and tech priests to draw the attention of warp denizens. In turn, this stream of tainted energy weighed down upon the leader Osh like a heavy lead burden, and all his senses warned of impending disaster. Across the battlefield, his Iron Hands made several attempts to reach their martyr-bound brothers, One wounded contemptor managed to break through the throngs of traitor legionaries to destroy one of the profane shrines with its half-ruined conversion beamer. The sympathetic annihilation of its own atomantic reactor tore the dreadnought apart at the same moment. Another shrine was also crushed and obliterated before its creators could reach the climax of their vile goal, descended through the cargo bay ceiling's ventilation ducts. Thalax and Ursarax units incinerated it, following some ingrained human instinct that seemingly compelled the lobotomized slaves to interfere with the cursed ritual out of pure revulsion. Even as both unholy dens were ablaze with fire, the dark liturgies echoing from their surviving copies reached their apex. Each barking syllable caused pain to those who heard it, every shadow contorted into truly nightmarish forms, while the actinic light from the landing bay floodlights seemed to retreat before the power of the incantation. Half hidden by the encroaching darkness that shrouded the horrifying altars of the lodge masters, figures began to tear forth from the corpses of the raiders' brutally tortured captives. The flesh of the unfortunate swelled and burst, as demons transformed the still-twitching bodies into portals for manifestation in real space. From the parted ranks of the Sons of Horus emerged creatures towering over terminators, monstrous horrors of immaterial sinew and twisted bone, summoned from the darkest nightmares and bent to the will of the traitors. Howling with voices equally painfully unnatural and nauseatingly familiar, the first trio of demons rushed towards the advancing iron hands, shredding ceramite and splattering blood in all directions. The manifested monsters flung the legionnaires aside, while their immaterial blades and teeth carved ragged wounds into the armor of the immortals. The esoterists of the Sons of Horus unleashed dozens of beast-like demons onto the battlefield, and each completed ritual allowed a greater number of their kin to penetrate the material realm. All were of the same stature, lopsided giants, crafted to overcome the loyalist space marines and their automatonic kin, though no two demons were truly identical. Some consisted of oozing, rotting flesh, others were accompanied by dancing, deadly flames, while yet others manifested in a dizzying array of terrifying configurations. Regardless of their external appearance, they were all equally lethal, cleaving legionnaires and cybernetica automatons with demonic weaponry that was a vile, distorted semblance of swords and hammers. The demons appeared to care for nothing but the slaughter they enacted, as the wave of hulking demons surged from the army of the Harbingers of Discord towards the encircling loyalists. The already ragged battle lines of the planet's defenders began to crumble amid the madness of ubiquitous melee skirmishes. The Iron Hands were nearly overwhelmed by the wave of nightmares, while the superior forces of Thyatira's automatons suddenly stopped. At the center of the blood-soaked carnage stood a jubilant Jaran Dagon, the savage runes inscribed on the ceramite of his armor now slick with freshly torn entrails. For 2 years he had capitulated to the indecipherable demands of the warrior lodges, redirecting his fleet and altering his company's doctrines in the name of carrying out a ritual that promised to not only deliver the entire Ohmn into his grasp, but also imbue Dagon and his warriors with secret power. Captain of the 84th could feel the warp seething around him as the ritual gained momentum, but before its demands could be legally binding, he would have to face the final trial. Leader Osh, whose armor was torn in 6 places and whose thunder hammer was slick with demonic blood, staggered away from the nearest throng of combatants. With a bloodlust born of desperation, Osh unleashed the powers he had kept in check since the Edict of Nicaea, striking the retinue of Chieftain Dagon with a volley of howling immaterial shards, ignoring the pain that shook his body with every contact with the warp. Cursing the enemy commander in every way possible, Osh roared a challenge to Captain Dagon, who gestured for his surviving bodyguards to withdraw so he could face the battle-worn Iron Hand personally. Dagon raised an elaborately adorned blade in a mocking salute, meeting Osh's hesitant attack with full confidence in his own superiority as a warrior, and assured that the liturgical rites inscribed on his armor would repel any sorcery from the weakened psyker. The duel lasted less than a minute. As a result of the clash, Osh fell to his knees on the cratered deck, with Dagon's longsword piercing his abdomen. With the swagger typical of a Chthonian pit fighter, Dagon showed off before his brethren, revelling in his triumph over a foe he smugly declared twice broken. It was perhaps the rage in response to this final insult that granted Osh the strength for a last deadly blow. Burning out his augmentics to push his mangled body forward, Leader Osh lunged toward the enemy leader when Dagon turned during another gloating display of his superiority, and with a mighty swing delivered a singular blow, with the thunderhammer in his remaining hand imbued with insurmountable force. Captain Dagon's head caved in mid-smirk, yet even as the Chthonian's retinue lunged to cut down the fallen Iron Hand, the body of the Sons of Horus commander remained disturbingly upright, while a mass of black flames flickered in a crude semblance of a skull atop his shoulders. The entity that had once been Jaran Dagon turned to Leader Osh and uttered a single fateful incantation before transforming the captain's flesh into a form that had haunted humanity's nightmares for millennia. Samus is here. At the very moment, the mighty demon, known to those with the requisite foul knowledge as Samus, burst into real space through the mutilated flesh of Captain Dagon. All of Ohmn's surface was plunged into hell itself. Dozens of immaterial rifts formed across the Forge world, spewing endless hordes of demons in every conceivable shape, as if birthed from death itself, tainting this world. Across the radiation-soaked wastelands to the east of Thyatira crawled a horde of hunched, corpse-like figures with peeling skin and bleeding eyes. Within the cramped Manufactoria arcologies located at the heart of the Forge Temple, Acheron, twisted creatures of metal and flesh tore with their claws at anything within reach, while the bastion wall of Sardis was besieged by monstrous cavalry clad in copper and bone barding. Unlike the demonic breed summoned by the Sons of Horus that descended upon the defenders of Thyatira, these warp-spawned horrors ignored the loyalty of those in their path, and spared no living thing as they surged upon Ohmn like an apocalyptic wave. Even Samus, the embodiment of spiteful and treacherous malevolence, remained bound to the will of the Sons of Horus thanks to the efforts of the esoterists of the 84th Company, and the binding wards intended to contain the apotheosis of Captain Dagon. Yet the demons manifesting freely across the Forge world pursued no goals other than their own. None know whether this was the expected consequence of the ritual intended to grant divinity to Dagon and his harbingers of discord, or merely the result of their ultimate failure following the captain's death. Nevertheless, the unfolding events became the true culmination of the spell that had defined the battle path of the 84th Company for the past 2 years, and the boundless terror of the Immaterium descended upon Ohmn in its entirety. For the Loyalists, all hope of defence or survival vanished in an instant, though those fighting near the core of Thyatira could not learn the truth of the events above for another 3 hours, while a handful of survivors fled deeper into the bowels of the Forge Temple. Yet for many, this knowledge seemed of little consequence. The battle for Thyatira was practically lost, and new waves of clumsy demon brutes sowed chaos among the Loyalist ranks. Bands of Myrmidon priests fought and died back-to-back amidst the surrounding madness, streams of data cataloguing the effectiveness of each weapon sample from their arsenals against the demonic horrors, even as they themselves were torn apart. The forces of Legio Cybernetica chaotically struggled to cope with beings that registered on their sensors as half-formed anomalies, increasingly losing direction as the remaining hunters and scouts of the Sons of Horus deliberately targeted Thyatira's magi. In turn, the Iron Hands, faced with an extermination as unforeseen as that which had doomed their brethren on Istvan V, cast aside their boarding shields and unsheathed their blades, determined to deliver a brutal and exceedingly personal death to as many Sons of Horus as possible. Samus, now fully manifested in his repugnant wolfish form, prowled the periphery of the unfolding carnage, hunting and exterminating Loyalists who attempted to escape into the labyrinth of conduits and service tunnels of Thyatira, and every particle of the nightmare creature's immaterial flesh seemed to revel in the torment of its victims. The only force able to slow his bloody hunt were 3 Iron Hand's contemptors that blocked the demon's path, while the surviving Magos of the Tagmata carried off the body of the miraculously still-living leader Osh from the battlefield. The vile instincts of Samus, which drove him to savour every murder in full, were likely the only reason for the survival of the Loyalists, who managed to retreat to the Forge Temple's final bastion. Each of the dreadnoughts standing in the path of the demonic abomination, encased in ceramite with adamantium plating, was a masterpiece of the craftsmen of the 10th Legion. Yet in a confrontation with a being of such unrestrained hatred as Samus, little could stand and hope to survive. Lasphia shredded the lumpy skin of the demon, and power fists struck his wolfish maw, but the beast's unnatural flesh reknitted itself, and serrated claws continued to tear open the dreadnoughts even as they landed blows. In response to the actions of his foes, Samus effortlessly breached their ceramite sarcophagi, severed limbs of the venerable warriors, and cleaved torsos, then methodically and unhurriedly dissected each, extracting the legionnaires entombed within to grant them final death in his ferocious jaws. When the desperate reality of the unfolding situation on Ohmn became apparent to the last enclave of loyalists of Osh, and the host of traitor legionnaires and bound diamonds closed in around them like a noose, they turned to their own well of accursed knowledge to deny the traitors their victory. Deep within Thyatira there lay hidden a device that had once rested in one of the myth-shrouded vaults of Mimir. Secret caches of techno-arcana deemed too dangerous by the late Primarch Ferrus Manus for anyone in the Imperium to wield. When Samus and his cadre of bound demons breached the inner defences of the Loyalist sanctuary, the latter activated the fearsome weapon, instantaneously incinerating the very air within the Forge Dome and triggering a conflagration that spread beyond Thyatira, igniting Ohmn atmosphere and enveloping the surface of the Forge world in a raging firestorm within mere minutes. Everything, except for the rocky surface of the planet itself, ignited instantly. The atomic reactors of the surviving Forge temples added their own explosive voices to the symphony of the surrounding inferno. The oceans were instantly turned to vapour, and the cities dissolved into streams of molten slag. Moments later, life itself was erased from Ohmn. But even after the entire planetary sphere was engulfed in torrents of flame, the fire continued to spread. Incredibly, every starship, planetary outpost and space installation maintaining active Vox communication with Ohmn at the moment it descended into a fiery hell was engulfed in precisely the same flames, and hundreds of pyres blazed throughout the surrounding system, transmitting the conflagration further through their own network of active Vox lines. The fleet of the 84th Company of the Sons of Horus exploded as the desperate pleas for help from the traitors stranded on the surface doomed them to destruction. The flagship Grand Cruiser Admonisher was the first to catch fire, and the fleet's Vox network ensured that the accompanying ships shared its fate. This fire raged in the void until all active Vox channels were exhausted, after which the emptiness of outer space at the system's boundary became the only effective barrier to its spread. Only when this absolute weapon lost the ability to propagate did the raging inferno within the system begin to gradually fade and die, and the intensity of the heat ensured that the accursed flames would touch no one again. For Ohmn itself, the end of destruction never came. The planet remained eternally suspended in the void as a sphere of inextinguishable fire that, in its burning, denied dominion to both men and demons alike.